Oh, no, it's okay, but I understand that. So anyway, hi, everybody who's here. My name is Martha Reynolds. I was selected to be the moderator. I was pulled to be the moderator of this panel. This is women's fiction. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what I do and what I write, and then I'll let my other panelists introduce themselves. I started writing in 2011, and I am the author of 8 novels and 1 tiny little nonfiction memoir that was written by my grandfather in 1924, but I turned it into a book. I write women's fiction pretty much primarily. It can be sometimes thought of as literary fiction, but it always has as its central figure a strong but flawed woman. A couple of my books are over here, as well as my cards, and I'm selling books at table 107. You can't miss it when you walk in the front door. I've got a green tablecloth and green lights. So I'll pass along to Jane Conway now.
Hi there. Thank you guys for coming. I started writing in 2014, and I am the author of 4 books. But I forgot to bring the 4th one, and I live on Block Island, so I wasn't going to swim back. I don't have a booth here today, so I apologize for that. I've done this every year since I started writing, and it's a great event, but things are a little hectic this year, and didn't do the whole day. But I guess that's just an intro, right? That's my introduction.
And now I'm going to turn it over to 2 women who write together, and that's Vicki Corliss, first in the red, and Lee Brown, and they'll introduce themselves as well.
So I'm Vicki in the red, Lee in the black. And we don't always dress like twins, but we are in charge of the raffle, the fantastic raffle, if I can point you in that direction. It's out in the lobby here today. So we just wanted to make sure we were identifiable and easy to find, so we dressed a little bit like twins today. Lee and I have been writing women's fiction also for almost 10 years now. We have 3 books that are on display here. Second Chances was our first book, The Pie Sisters was our second, and the third was just released called The Pendulum's Truth. But we are sort of unique to people because we write together. We can tell you a little bit more about that in a bit, but I'll let Lee take it from there.
So I'm Lee Brown, and as Vicki said, we write together, and we actually started out as friends many, many years ago. We met when our 2 boys were playing baseball together. And I was behind home plate, and I was reading a book, and this lovely woman came up to me, and she said, "I've read that book." And it was a series, and she said, "Have you read all the ones before that?" And I said, "No, I just picked it up at Sam's Club." And she said, "Well, I've got to read the first 8, and this was number 9. So we got to talking, and we decided that we both shared this wonderful love of reading. And that's how our friendship began, and we were exchanging books back and forth. And eventually it turned into a time of life where we both had sort of a bucket list in our head. And interestingly enough, on both of our lists was to write a book. So because we were good friends by that point, we said, hey, let's give it a shot. It took us a while to get in the groove, but that's how our authorship started.
So if you're sitting here this afternoon, I assume you have an interest in women's fiction. But women's fiction can be a very hard genre to define, and I think the best way is to start by telling you what women's fiction is not. Women's fiction is not chick lit. It's different. Chick lit is its own genre. Some of the books that are considered to be chick lit are Sophie Kinsella's Confessions of a Shopaholic, think Sex and the City, Bridget Jones' Diaries, usually very light in tone. They usually involve some girlfriends, some maybe shopping, high-end shoes, but they're much lighter in tone than women's fiction. The women portrayed in chick lit tend to be single and in their late 20s or maybe in their 30s, and a lot of times they live in a large city. Women's fiction is also not romance. Just because a woman is at the center of a book does not mean there's going to be a romance. So in my books, I rarely have a happily ever after. What I have is what I like to call a satisfactory ever after. So you want to tie things up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the woman has to end up with a man at the end. That's romance. And in romance, you're going to introduce the two characters, whether they're a man and a woman, two women, two men. They're going to end up together at the end of the book, if it's a romance. And within romance, you have a lot of different genres, subgenres, like Christian romance, or paranormal romance, or historical romance, but it's romance. It's not women's fiction. So, if women's fiction is hard to define, here are some questions to ask. Is it fiction for women? Mostly, yes. I can tell you men read women's fiction. My husband reads my books, and he enjoys them, and I've had other men read my books, as I'm sure my panelists have had that experience as well. So, it is fiction mostly for women. Is it feminist fiction? It can be. Is it written only by women? No, it doesn't have to be, although it usually is written by women. Women's fiction is described as a story where the plot is driven by the main character's emotional journey. The goal and intent of women's fiction is to be able to relate to the character. And I've heard that from my panelists, I've heard that about their characters. You want, as you read it, you want to be able to relate to the character that appears in women's fiction. So I'd like to ask my panelists to describe, if they can, to describe the emotional journey of one or more of their characters. We'll start with Lee and Vicki.
Any book?
Any book.
Okay, so I'll pick the book that is our newest book, The Pendulum's Truth. And the main character is Ava Dell. And she is a gal that is very intuitive, very spiritual. And the book started because we were talking about the premise that everything happens for a reason. And Ava has an intuitive side to her that she kind of disregards most of her life until she becomes a grown woman. And she finds more practical applications for it. And she is gifted a pendulum, and with this pendulum, really gets in touch with her spiritual side. She has ups and downs through the book, but her journey, we reflect on her life journey in this story, and really her span of emotions as she comes into connection with spirituality for herself and for others. Something upsetting happens in the book, and then she spends the rest of the story trying to find really her spiritual journey and what's really important in life.
As Martha was saying just a few minutes ago, it's really about connecting to the characters that we write about, and I don't think that Lee and I choose to write women's fiction. I think we sort of fell into it because it's writing about what we know and what we feel as women ourselves. So, for example, the first book that we wrote called Second Chances is the story of a woman named Pashmina who made some very poor choices early in her life that as a mature adult catch up to her and come back to bite her in the derriere, as my mother would say. And she spends the rest of the story really trying to find a way to get her life back on track, to bring order back into her life. And as we have talked to people that come by our table to talk about our books, I tell them this description, and I haven't met a person yet who hasn't nodded at us and said, oh yeah, who hasn't made a mistake in life, who hasn't screwed up. So we just sort of fell into the style of writing because it is very much about what we've experienced as women or what we can relate to and talk about as someone.
Jane, do you want to talk about the emotional journey of one or more of your characters too?
Sure. I don't think I can talk about my characters though without talking a little bit about how I started to write about them. It was one of my bucket list items as well to write a book, and in 2014 I had read an article. Now, I was not planning on writing a book. I read this article that basically was saying that, write an autobiography. it's very therapeutic, and I was at this point in my life, kind of crossroads situation. So I think I wrote about 3 pages about my own life and said, well, this is boring. I already know what happens here. And, you know, I've had my ups and downs in life for sure. I'm divorced, single mom of 3 kids. I gave up my career as a teacher originally to support my ex-husband in his career. And then when I got divorced, tried to get back into teaching. So I've had a roller coaster ride myself. I am teaching now, by the way, so I'm very happy with that. But I found that with my first book, the character is a lot like young me, in that she was very idealistic, and life throws some curveballs, and it's how do you deal with these curveballs that life throws you. And I feel like, I guess that's an overarching theme in all of my books, that we all have this idealistic view of what our lives are going to be like, and it's never what we imagine it to be. So in my first book, it was, well, what ending would I have liked to have had, you know? So I kind of went with that, and it turned into a book. And then I was like, well, what do I do with that? And I ended up bringing it to an editor, and the editor helped me out, and then I got it published. So it turned into a kind of an obsessive writing career. But it really saved me in many ways, because I found an outlet, as my characters found their own outlets for the troubles that they've encountered and how they move forward.
And I think that's really crucial to writing women's fiction, that your character and characters need to have some sort of an emotional journey. I mean, you want to go a little bit deeper. That's why you're not writing chick lit. You're writing women's fiction just because you want to delve in a little bit deeper. In my book, Villa del Sol, my character, Jennifer Logan, has just lost her husband. And her husband was the senior senator from Rhode Island. Jennifer was a second wife, intelligent, but very often judged on her looks, and deemed to be a trophy wife or gold digger. So with his death, Jennifer gets out of town. She goes to the Swiss-Italian border town and rents a villa. There's plenty of money, and tries to process through her grief, which is a very complicated emotion for her, because of the way she was brought up and the way she was treated, and being the senator's wife. And she's really on a journey to find herself, if you will. So that was the emotional journey I have. I tend to put grief into my books because it's such an emotion, it's such a thing that you have to process. And you can do it in a number of ways, and it depends on who has passed. So we write for specific people generally. The same way that if you write young adult fiction, you write for a typical reader of a certain age. In women's fiction, do you have an age range for your typical reader?
Do I? Well, I find that, yeah, I write for my age range. I shoot for the 30s to 40s group, but I find that a lot of my readers are older than that and younger, so it's really, I've been happy that I've been able to appeal to a wide age range. But I also feel like, how can somebody who's so young, somebody in their teen years, like I won't allow my students, my high school kids, I'm like, you're not reading my books. I don't even tell them I write. And then when they find out, I'm like, nope, that's not me. Nope, you can't read that. But how can you relate to these things that happen in life? You haven't experienced anything really at this point, you know? So how can you identify with these characters who are struggling with marriages, or being a mother, or changing career paths, or feeling lost? I know you can feel lost as a teenager, but not the kind of lost you feel when you've got 3 kids and you are getting a divorce. That's a whole different kind of lost. So,
How about you guys?
I'd say it really does go by the topic of the story. I would say that if we had to give an age range, our readership is 18 and above. But for example, second chances, we've had people come up and say, would this be appropriate for my 16-year-old? And probably not, definitely not your 13-year-old. There are curse words in there is probably about the strongest part about it. And not that kids don't know the curse words at 13, but I'm not going to be the one responsible for the mother getting upset because her child's reading curse words. But the topics are very different. And so, for example, The Pie Sisters, our second book, is really the story of sisterhood and family. It's about summertime, water, all very sweet, sentimental things. And so I really think it appeals to anyone of any age. The new book, The Pendulum's Truth, this whole idea of everything happens for a reason. Again, I think an 18-year-old probably would enjoy it, but differently than, say, someone in their 30s or 40s who's had some time to live and experience things happening for a reason, and that whole questioning of, does it happen for a reason? Has anything happened? Could I have seen it coming? Could I have done anything different?
I don't have a lot to add, but I was just going to say, you had talked about including grief in your stories, and we, in some instances, have done the same thing. I think it's an emotional journey that does require a lot of growth or processing or whatever. So we are always mindful too that our reader is most likely a grown-up. We dabbled in romance very badly for our first book, and promptly had our mothers read the book, and that was the end of that. So there's really no theme regarding a sexual nature that we worry about someone young. But I think it's more of just, like you were saying, what you go through. It's marriages, or grieving with your parents dying, or a sibling dying, those kind of things that may not be appropriate for the YA reader.
And a younger reader just may not be able to relate to some of those issues as well. I think that if you're a college student, it just may be something that you won't have an interest in because it's not something that you're living. So I think that with women's fiction, generally I see it like an 18 and up, and it can go way up. I'm old, so I know you're filming it, but I don't write for my age because I'm old. So I do try to write a little bit younger than that without going into the 20s because I don't have children. I don't know. I'm out of the loop as far as 20-year-old young women are, what they're doing. I kind of know a little bit, but I don't pretend to be in tune with young college women. So, if I'm writing for an age range of, say, maybe 35 and up, I probably am not going to have 18-year-olds reading my book. But from 35 on, yeah, it's probably going to fit in there somewhere, as with most women's fiction authors. So if we can just, we're going to talk a little bit about romance because, as I mentioned, women's fiction may have elements of romance in it, but it isn't essential to the story. Whereas if you're writing a romance, you have to have a happily ever after. You have to have the two characters that generally you introduce early on. No matter what they go through, they have to end up together at the end. That's a romance. But in women's fiction, you don't have to have that happily ever after. So talk about how you've treated the element of romance or the possibility of romance in your books.
I think at least 2 out of the 3, there's most definitely a hint of a relationship or a romance. But as you said, it's not primary to the story. It provides an emotional connection. We're exploring how that particular character is dealing with a relationship, but it doesn't define the story at all. And then the last book, it just wasn't necessary for the story we were telling. So she has really good friends, but other than that, a relationship was not necessary.
And I would just add that in the last book that the relationships that do exist in the story are friendships that are mostly like family friendships, or relationships, I should say. So it's not romantic. There's still a relationship. There's still people to connect with and people that you're rooting for because of their friendship, but it's not romantic.
All 4 of my books are relationship centered, actually, and so I've always said I write realistic romance in a way because there is always that element, but there's also the friendship element and family dynamics. And I mean, one thing that I definitely have addressed in not all of them, but definitely in my second book, As It Seems, and my latest one, A Good Wife. These women, they struggle with motherhood. Just the idea of motherhood and how much you give up of yourself when you also get a lot added when you become a mother to your life, but you also give up something. And a couple of my characters, the main character in this book in particular, Libby, she struggles with having her own life and wanting what's best for her kids. And there's another character in this book too as well, it's her friend next door who really just doesn't appreciate, she doesn't want to be the full-time mom. And how society really kind of shames women who are basically doing what the divorced man does and has their kids every weekend or every other weekend, and how that's really not very fair. And perhaps that's what's best for the children, you know? So I delve into that in that particular book.
So I wanted to give you some statistics, and I want to give you guys a chance to ask us questions as well. But if you are considering writing women's fiction, this is from the American Bookseller Association and the Book Industry Study Group. Women's fiction comprises at least 40% of adult popular fiction sold in the U.S., and approximately 60% of adult popular fiction paperbacks. According to a Gallup poll, we're talking about a $24 billion industry. Women read more than men, and women buy more books than men. So, women's lives are important in books. And if you are considering writing women's fiction, I would encourage it. I think that there's definitely a readership available to you. There's a market available to you. In some cases, you want to consider sometimes, especially if you're looking to go, if you're not looking to publish independently, you might want to go try to find an agent and have a traditional publishing deal. What they love to see these days is sort of a big picture. I'm thinking of a book called The Help, if you're familiar with it. It's women's fiction, but it encompasses a very broad picture of life in Mississippi, life with domestic servants, racial issues that were back in the 40s, 50s, early 60s. It encompasses a lot of true history, and it was a bestseller. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But that's a lot of what traditional publishers are looking for in women's fiction, is something that brings in a big picture story as well. So if anybody has questions for any of us, I would invite you to ask them. Or if any of you guys have things to add as well.
Oh, well, it's not really, well, not as a question, it's more a comment, because you were talking about age. And, like, I'm 27, and I am still in my 20s, but I'm past college, I'm in my career, you know, and I have friends that are married. I have friends that are having their first babies. I've actually already had a friend that's gotten divorced. She got married really young and then is already now divorced at the age of 26. So when you're talking about age, yes, but also age is a number, and some people have, so I know people who could identify with your books because they actually do have those experiences at maybe not the age that more people have it, but...
I found it interesting when younger readers come up to me and tell me how much they enjoyed my books, and I'm always like, well, what about it did you enjoy? Like, I'm curious, and it's different things that maybe I would have identified with, but they're pulling what they want
Yeah.
or what they can identify with from the
From
book.
it, yeah.
So yes, they make the connections. It's just maybe different connections than I would have made.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
That's fair.
So two things. One, thank you for looking at me when you would sit there. I love that. And then right after, he was like, she looked right at me at 36, so thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was awesome. Made my
I should give you a book.
But my second question's kind of like an overall. So women's lit, I think, is probably one of the more interesting genres. If you look at horror, you look at romance, and so with those, there's kind of a level of disconnection, essentially, right? For people, you can pander to people who at women's lit, I kind of get the sense that you're essentially in love and kind of giving a little bit of yourself to each of your characters. But I think the thing with women's lit too is because of the gravity of the subjects that you guys are writing about, there's also a level of like criticism that when it comes your way, do you feel in your experience it tends to maybe sting a little bit more than for the person who might be writing like your horror story? Because yeah, everybody knows the serial killers and this and that, but when you're talking about women's lit, you're talking about things that affect people on such an emotional level that it stings a little bit more maybe than, you know, the average person who doesn't like the serial killer maybe. Just kind of thoughts on that.
I'd love to see that. That's interesting.
I would say, from my standpoint, absolutely. When I was trying to come up with a tagline for my books, I came up with real, true fiction. Mostly because all of my fiction is based in an element of truth. There's always a piece of truth. The first book I wrote, and many people write a first book that's a little bit autobiographical. When I was in college, I went abroad for a year. I studied in Switzerland for a year. And while I was there, in the late 70s, my father died unexpectedly. So there were no cell phones, there was no internet. And it affected me profoundly to the point that, you know, it's affected my entire life. I knew when I wrote my first book, I knew that was the book I wanted to write. But I had a very boring year. I mean, I didn't have a boyfriend. I didn't get thrown in jail. Nothing happened. So I created this character, and I put her on this journey. And so from that little bit of truth, which I could use internally for the horrible emotion of the grief, I was able to tap into that. The rest of it was all made up, and it was just this, you know, this fantasy for this young woman. But I had parents saying, you know, they wanted to their young daughters to read the book because she gets pregnant and all kinds of problems. And so yeah, a little bit of the truth. And then when someone comes back and says, "Oh, that was a horrible book," that was partly my life. How could you say that? It was like a criticism of me or what I had gone through. So yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, but I think if you, I don't know, at least in my experience, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about it, but there is definitely a little piece of me and in every writer and everything that they write. But I know when I put it out there, when I made the decision to publish it, I said not everybody is going to like this, and that's okay. And for me, it was kind of, I'm open for constructive criticism always, you know? So that kind of criticism, I was like, bring it, you know? And the people that are just like, I hate that book, I was like, oh well, I don't like horror books, so that's okay. Do you know what I mean? So I personally didn't take it personally. But I can imagine if you don't make that deal with yourself in the beginning, that it's very hurtful, you know.
For us, first of all, we chose to write fiction for the very reason that although there is research done in each of the stories that we've written, it is fiction, non-fiction. It is based on fact, and people can correct you and say, "All right, you're wrong." And even though I've done all my research, I would find that very painful to be corrected. So this is purely of our imagination, purely of us. Yes, we write from the heart, as you were saying, but you can't correct it. You can't say we're wrong. When I feel we've been most successful is when somebody comes up to us and says, "How could you have done that?" And we've gotten more reactions from our first book where something happens and people who have read the book and come up to us afterwards and say, "How could you? What were you thinking?" And we're like, yes, we scored. We got under their skin. We got them engaged. We got them to feel the story. And the Pie Sisters, again, family, sisterhood. We have more sisters, friends who are like sisters to each other. who read this book and they're just like, oh my God, I love the bond. It's just like the bond I have with my own sisters. Or they want to buy copies for those friends who don't live nearby because they want them to feel the sisterhood again.
I just want to add one quick thing. So our three stories are very different from each other. They're not connected in any way. And particularly finishing the third one recently, I had to say to myself, these are three very different stories. Not everyone is going to like all three. And that's okay, because you may relate to one and not the other, or two are great and one you didn't like because something happened that you weren't expecting or you didn't appreciate. I think it's really hard to do, but I think you do yourself a disservice if you don't say, it's okay. I'm not going to appeal to every single person on every single book.
Yes.
Hi, I'd like to ask you guys a question about the way you measure writing. Like, mechanically, how does that look? What does it look like? Do you write something and then throw her away? I don't know.
So first, I'd like to congratulate you. That is the second most asked question about us. The first question is, are you sisters? Which we are not. But
I already figured that out.
it's a very involved process in that we try to be very meticulous. We first talk out our storyline with each other. It starts from a nugget or a grain of an idea and grows just through the process of discussion. And I always say Lee is a very copious note taker, so every thought we throw out gets written down. And once we feel we have the shape of the story, we'll go back through and say, okay, do all those thoughts still have a home within the story? Once the outline of the story from beginning to end is outlined, we then break it down into first character development. So we fully develop each and every character, not just in terms of physical description, but ethical beliefs. Do they have allergies? Where in the country do they live? Everything about this person, because you never know what little bit of each character will fit into the story somewhere in some quirky or interesting way. And then we outline every chapter to the finest detail, so that it's not a matter of, it doesn't matter which of us writes each chapter. We know what has to be said. We just have to write the chapter. So I may take the first two chapters, and Lee takes the next two. We do write the chapters in order of the story.
The only thing I want to add is, interestingly enough, now for 3 books, I know her voice so well as a writer, and I would say vice versa. It gets easier and easier because I can't anticipate her spin on things, and she me. So the first book where you're just trying to hash it out and you're writing one way and you're writing the other way, we've gotten closer and closer as each book has gone on.
And do people notice the difference in who writes what?
Well, we're really lucky that after we're finished and we go through a self-editing process, we send it to an editor to make sure that it really does sound like one voice, because that would be very disjointed if it didn't. So that's an important part of the process.
Yes.
I have a question. So, I know just in general in all forms of writing, diversifying based on the writers, diversifying stories. How is the women's fiction stories being written by not just white authors, or not just I just don't know as much about the category. So I just know how diverse is the stories becoming more diverse. For example, about a lot of women's fiction I've seen is there's white characters. They're from New England. They're from some common places. I just didn't know when you think about other parts of the world or other cultures, or is it?
I mean, I belong to a couple of social media groups, and I find that my African American friends write African American women's fiction because it's their experience. An Asian friend that I have tends to write women's fiction from an Asian standpoint with mostly Asian characters. I think it's if they're basing it on their own experiences, that's what's going to come through. At the same time, I've been aware of it as I write, that I don't want to write too white, because that's not real life.
Right.
So I can create characters based on people that I know in my own life. They're not carbon copies of those people, but they can certainly bring more depth to the writing, and they can bring other angles to the writing. And I'll always call someone or contact someone if I need help with it, because I want to get it right too. If I have, say, an Indian character, I want to make sure I get that right. I have people I can tap into to make sure that I get that right.
I think a good example of, I call his work women's fiction because I think the majority of his readers are women, is Wally Lamb. And I've met him briefly, talked to him for like 5 minutes, basically. He's one of my favorite writers, but he writes from a woman's perspective. And the first time I read one of his books, I think it was She's Come Undone. It was an excellent book. And I was like, how did he do that? So when I met him, that was what I said. I was just like, how do you write from a woman's point of view so effectively? And this was before I had finished my first book. And he just said, he just taps into some other part of him. So when I write my books, I actually write from a woman's point of view and then from a man's point of view. And it's not as hard as you think to get, at least from male-female perspective. I mean, when it comes to racial or ethnic difference, I mean, that's something you need some experience with in order to write it accurately or authentically,
So 2 questions. One, what was the series that you guys talked about in the middle that you met under? What was that series?
Janet Ivanovich. She wrote 1 for the Money, 2 for the Road.
Right. And then the second question is, you guys are all divorced, 3 children, now you're back into the chain.
Married, no children.
Married, no children. Obviously, you guys met because your sons played baseball together, so you guys are obviously holding down full-time lives, but you guys are also writing. So for me, I'm 36, I work full-time. I don't have children yet. It's obviously in the near future. It's longer. I'm sorry, like not with her, but it's my mother. Sorry. So how do you guys find the time? What does that look like? Because one of the things I have always struggled with personally and professionally is time management, but writing has always been a passion. So how do you manage your full-time lives with your passion for writing, and how does this come from that? Because it's all quite impressive. So talk a little bit about that if you can.
I'm going to pass it off quickly because I will tell you that while I always wanted to write from the time I was very young, I had a career that I hated, and I had nothing left when I came home. I worked in a job because I needed a paycheck, but I didn't like what I did, and I needed to work, and when I came home I had no creativity left to pour out of me, so it wasn't until I walked away from that job, and like I said, I'm old. So I'm basically retired now.
Yeah.
Now I can devote it. Now I can write a book a year. My friends are not, so I'm going to pass it on to them and ask them to talk about that.
I'm very impressed you can write a book a year. It's hard. It's really hard. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. We're very blessed that we can write together. So a lot of single writers end up with writer's block. I was talking to an author today, and he said, I've got 8 books at home that are going nowhere. He just can't get the characters where he wants them to be, so he kind of waits and he moves on to something else. We're lucky in that, when we get to that point, we have each other, and we sort of push and prod each other along. But I'll tell you, it really is a commitment. I think you just have to find the time. We get a lot of people that stop at our table and say, I have this great book in my head, I just don't know how to get it out on paper. And we always say to them, just do it. Just do it.
I will say, speaking for myself, when Lee and I first started writing Second Chances, I was in the umpteenth year of a career that I actually loved. I was in marketing for many years and was very busy, and part of the reason it took us 4 years to write Second Chances is because I was working and had a commitment to an office, and it was hard to find the time to do your job and do it well and put in the time necessary to do both those things, but also give the time and attention that writing a story. And it was our first book, so we really didn't know what we were doing. We had a lot that we were trying to figure out and trying to write together, which in many ways is a blessing, but when you're first starting off, there was a lot of figuring out how do you have two people working on the one thing. So I ultimately was very fortunate because in about the third year of our writing, I was able to have a conversation with my husband and explain to him that I was treading water basically. I didn't feel like I was being overly productive and getting 100% to my job anymore. And I didn't feel that I was being productive and giving 100% to me and the writing effort, second chances. So we had a discussion and he gave me his blessing to resign from my position and put full-time effort towards writing. So I sort of have the best of both worlds. I had a career that I loved and time to do time.
And I'm going to mention this real quickly because I want to let Jane have the last word. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's something called National Novel Writing Month. It just passed. It was in November, but they do it again in the summer. I think they call it Camp National Novel Writing Month. It's something that you might want to try. I've written 2 books that way, and it's a month. Say in November, they ask you to write 50,000 words in a month, and it's fun. You can join groups. You do it online, and it's kind of, it'll keep you on track. I mean, it's like 1,600 words a day, but you can do it. And if you just spit it out, the first draft, it doesn't have to be pretty. Just get it out there, and then you can work on fixing it. But that's something to consider. Look it up online, National Novel Writing Month.
Yeah, they call it NaNoWriMo. Yeah. But when I started writing, for me it was just a matter, I had to get it out. So how do I balance it? Well, my kids, here's one of them, here's Zoe. And my daughter Olivia's back there. I would be sitting at the table, and I didn't really set any specific goals for myself, but I mean, I have vacations, I have summer, I'm a teacher, so I do have some time. And so I get the bulk of my writing done pretty much between April break and the start of the new school year. I just get it out as much as possible and then revise when the new school year starts. So I've pretty much averaged 1 a year since I started writing, except for this past year. It's just been crazy. So
if I could just add
You'll
to
find
that,
a way.
if you have a sense of your writing style, Lee and I, as she said, we're starting to become very familiar with each other's writing styles now after the 3 books. But when we first started, we had very different styles and ways of writing. I need a completely silent room. I can't have music going. I can't have a television going. I can't have any distractions. And I do like to try to put together sentences and paragraphs in what I know is going to be edited, but is sort of final form. I like it to flow, and that takes time. I mean, I spent more hours, I think, staring out the window trying to get one paragraph well written that was totally edited later on down the road, but in my mind it was well written. Lee, as she likes to say, you could put her in the middle of Warwick Mall at Christmas time and have hubbub going around her, and it's a movie in her head that she just throws the words down. It's not pretty, it's not polished, but she's got the idea of what she's trying to say there. So that is a lot quicker way to write. So that's sort of your style. That's all.
Okay, good. You get it done.
I'm like that too, especially with the kids running around. I could pretty much, the whirlwind could be going on around me, and I'm in the zone. I see it as a movie as well.
Yeah.
That's exactly how I describe
It's
it.
kind of neat because
Yeah.
as you see the story unfolding, I mean, I can see the
See it.
character, I can see the action, I can see it happening. I know what, there's this lovely little tea cozy we have in our latest book. I knew what it looked like inside and out. I knew what the door handle looked like. I knew the rug, the welcome mat. It's just in my head.
Isn't it
So
fascinating? I
it's
love that. Yep.
I figure we'll work it out later.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you use Pinterest?
Yeah.
Some
I
people,
tried to.
some people actually create a storyboard using Pinterest. They might find the celebrities for the characters they have. They say, oh, this is the person I can see playing this part, or here's the place where the story takes place. And they create storyboards that can help them stay focused as they're writing.
One of my books I wrote, this part of it took place in Verona. Now, I've been all over Italy, and I love the city of Verona, but I've never actually visited it. So I went onto Google Earth and I literally walked the streets and could see the buildings literally as, just in my head I kind of knew where I wanted that character to go and visit and see, and I could see it all on Google Earth. So people that have been there came to me afterwards, one of my friends in particular, she was like, that was so cool. When were you in Verona? Because she stays there in the summers. And I'm like, I've never been to Verona. She's like, you described it exactly. Like, it was so precise. I'm like, Google Earth, baby.
Matthew, how are we? Are we done?
Yep, that would be it.
Okay. Listen, thanks to everybody for coming to this panel presentation. I really appreciate it. I hope maybe it was a little bit of inspiration if you're interested in writing, and you can contact any of us. I mean, really, we've done it, so we can help you if you need help.
Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you.